In 1920, America's most dangerous man wasn't hiding in shadows. He walked the streets in broad daylight, wearing expensive suits and smiling for cameras. His name was Al Capone, and he ruled the city while everyone watched. This is the story of how the most feared gangster in American history built an empire on blood and whiskey, manipulated an entire nation into loving him, and ultimately fell not to bullets or rival gangs, but to something far more mundane: paperwork. This is the rise and tragic collapse of Scarface himself, a man whose legend still haunts the dark alleys of Chicago nearly a century later. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on the 17th of January, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents who dreamed of the American promise. His father was a barber, his mother a seamstress. They were hard-working, religious, and hoped their children would climb the ladder of respectability. But young Alphonse had other plans. He dropped out of school at 14 after punching a teacher in the face. That single act of violence foreshadowed a lifetime of brutality masked by charm. The streets became his classroom, and his teachers were the mobsters of the 5 Points gang. It was here, in the grimy underworld of early 20th century New York, that Capone learned the rules that would make him a king. Loyalty is everything. Violence is currency, and fear is the most effective form of respect. At 18, working as a bouncer and bartender at a dive bar called the Harvard Inn, Capone made a mistake that would mark him forever. He insulted a woman, and her brother slashed his face 3 times with a knife. The scars ran deep across his left cheek. From that moment on, he was Scarface, though he hated the nickname and would rage at anyone who used it in his presence. He told people the scars were war wounds from his time in the Lost Battalion during World War I. It was a lie. But Capone understood early that controlling your image was just as important as controlling territory. That facial scar became his brand, a physical manifestation of danger that preceded him into every room. In 1919, Capone was invited to Chicago by his mentor, Johnny Torrio, a calculating gangster who saw opportunity in the chaos of Prohibition. The 18th Amendment had just banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol across the United States. It was supposed to create a more moral America. Instead, it created the greatest criminal opportunity in history. Americans didn't stop drinking, they just started drinking illegally, and men like Torrio and Capone were ready to supply the demand. When Capone arrived in Chicago, he was nobody, a bodyguard, a grunt. But he was smart, ruthless, and unnervingly charismatic. Within 2 years, he was Torrio's right-hand man. By 1925, after Torrio barely survived an assassination attempt and retired in fear, Al Capone, at just 26 years old, became the boss of the Chicago outfit. What followed was an empire unlike anything America had seen. Capone didn't just run a criminal organization, he ran a corporation. He controlled speakeasies, breweries, distilleries, gambling houses, brothels, and even legitimate businesses like laundries and restaurants. At his peak, his operation was pulling in an estimated $100 million a year. That is over $1.5 billion in today's money. He employed thousands. He had politicians, judges, and police officers on his payroll. Chicago wasn't just influenced by Capone. It was owned by him. The mayor couldn't sneeze without Capone knowing about it. The police raided competitors while protecting Capone's operations. Judges dismissed cases. Witnesses disappeared. Capone had turned corruption into an art form. But here is where the story gets strange, almost paradoxical. Al Capone was a murderer, a racketeer, a criminal overlord. And yet, during the Great Depression, he became a hero to many Americans. While banks foreclosed on homes and families starved, Capone opened soup kitchens in Chicago. He fed thousands of unemployed, desperate people. No questions asked, newspapers ran stories with headlines like, "Capone feeds the hungry," and "Modern Robin Hood saves the city." He was photographed shaking hands with children, handing out turkeys at Thanksgiving, smiling warmly for the camera. He tipped waiters $100. He bought coal for poor families in winter. He attended Mass every Sunday and donated generously to the church, to much of the public, especially the working class. Capone wasn't a villain. He was a benefactor, a man who understood their suffering and did something about it while the government did nothing. This was calculated. Capone knew the power of public opinion. He gave interviews to journalists, always well-dressed, always eloquent. He called himself a businessman providing a service people wanted. "I make my money by supplying a public demand," he said. "If I break the law, my customers are as guilty as I am." It was a brilliant defense. He positioned himself as a scapegoat, a man punished for giving people what they craved. He cultivated the image of the lovable outlaw, the gangster, with a heart of gold. And it worked. Even as the FBI labeled him public enemy #1, ordinary people saw him as one of them, a self-made man, an immigrant success story. The American dream with a gun. But beneath that polished surface was unspeakable violence. Capone's rise to power was built on blood. He eliminated rivals with chilling efficiency, bombings, drive-by shootings, disappearances, bodies found in ditches, rivers, and car trunks. If you threatened Capone's empire, you didn't get a warning. You got a funeral, and Capone himself was no distant CEO. He participated. He beat men to death with baseball bats. He ordered executions while eating dinner. He was present, hands on, visceral in his brutality. He wanted people to know that behind the smile and the expensive cigars was a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. The most infamous example came on the 14th of February, 1929, Valentine's Day. 7 members of the North Side gang, rivals of Capone, were lured to a garage on North Clark Street under the pretense of a meeting about a whiskey shipment. When they arrived, men dressed as police officers walked in. The gangsters, thinking it was a routine shakedown, lined up against the wall. Then the machine guns came out. Over 70 bullets tore through them in seconds. Blood splattered the brick wall. Bodies crumpled. Only one man survived long enough to speak, and when asked who shot him, he said, "Nobody shot me." The code of silence held even in death. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked America. It was theatrical, brutal, and unmistakably a message. This was Capone's world. Cross him, and you die publicly, humiliatingly, and without mercy. The brilliant, chilling detail. Capone was in Florida when it happened, sipping drinks, meeting with officials, establishing a rock-solid alibi. He orchestrated the massacre from 1,000 miles away. The FBI knew it, the police knew it, but they couldn't prove it. Capone was, in a very literal sense, untouchable, and yet, for all his power, all his money, all his political influence, Al Capone had a strange vulnerability. He was obsessed with his appearance and hygiene. He changed his silk underwear 3 times a day. He owned hundreds of custom-tailored suits. He bathed multiple times daily and used expensive colognes. His nails were always manicured. His shoes always shined. Some historians believe this obsession stemmed from a deep insecurity, a poor immigrant kid trying to prove he belonged among the elite. Others think it was a manifestation of early-stage syphilis, which causes obsessive behaviors. Either way, the image was everything. Capone wanted to look like a king because he believed if you looked powerful, you were powerful. But there was a darker secret eating away at him somewhere in his youth, likely during his time working in brothels. Capone contracted syphilis in the 1920s. This was a death sentence if untreated, and Capone refused treatment. Whether out of embarrassment, denial, or ignorance, he let the disease fester. Syphilis is insidious. It hides for years, quietly destroying the body and brain. And as Capone built his empire, the bacteria were building their own inside him. Despite his crimes, his violence, and his power, the government couldn't touch him. Traditional law enforcement was useless. Witnesses were too terrified to testify. Evidence disappeared. Judges were bought. Juries were intimidated. Capone seemed immune to justice. The FBI was desperate. They needed a new approach. Enter Eliot Ness and his team of incorruptible agents nicknamed the Untouchables. Ness targeted Capone's operations, raiding breweries, seizing trucks, destroying supply lines. It was symbolic, a thorn in Capone's side, but it didn't bring him down. What ultimately destroyed Al Capone wasn't a raid or a shootout, it was an accountant. The Internal Revenue Service, led by Agent Frank Wilson, began investigating Capone's finances. They discovered something astonishing. Capone had never filed a tax return. Despite making millions, he paid nothing to the government. Wilson and his team painstakingly traced Capone's income through ledgers, receipts, and testimonies from bookkeepers. They built a case not on murder or racketeering, but on tax evasion. It was brilliant in its simplicity. You can't prove he ordered a killing, but you can prove he bought a mansion and claimed no income. In 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. He was confident. He tried to bribe the jury. The judge, sensing this, switched juries at the last minute. Capone was blindsided. On the 17th of October 1931, he was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The most powerful gangster in America, a man who had ordered hundreds of deaths, was defeated by the tax code. It was absurd, poetic, tragic. Capone was sent to Alcatraz, the most secure prison in the country. In 1934, The Rock, isolated, brutal. Here, Capone was just another inmate. No special treatment, no bribes, no power, and worse, the syphilis was accelerating. His mind began to deteriorate. He became confused, paranoid, childlike. Fellow inmates reported that he would sit in his cell, talking to himself, laughing at nothing. His body weakened, his once commanding presence crumbled. In 1939, after serving 7 years, Capone was released early due to his declining health. But he was no longer Scarface. He was a ghost. He retreated to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida, where he lived out his final years in a haze of dementia. His mind was so ravaged by syphilis that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. He spent his days fishing in his pool, often not catching anything, sometimes not even remembering why he was there. The man who once controlled an empire couldn't control his own thoughts. On the 25th of January, 1947, after suffering a stroke and pneumonia, Al Capone died. He was 48 years old. His death was quiet. No shootout, no dramatic last words. Just a sick, broken man fading away in obscurity. The newspapers ran obituaries, but the world had moved on. Capone had become a relic, a cautionary tale, a ghost story parents told to scare children. But his legacy lived on. He changed organized crime forever. He showed that criminals could be celebrities, that violence and charm could coexist, that empires could be built on vice and corruption, and most hauntingly, he proved that power is fleeting. No matter how untouchable you think you are, time, disease, and inevitably, the system will come for you. So what do we make of Al Capone? Was he a monster? Absolutely. A murderer? A tyrant? A man who profited from suffering? But he was also a product of his time, a poor immigrant who saw prohibition as the ultimate opportunity and seized it with both hands. He understood the human hunger for what is forbidden. He exploited it ruthlessly, and for a brief, blazing moment, he was unstoppable. But in the end, he was stopped, not by bullets, not by rivals, but by paperwork, and by a disease he refused to acknowledge. There is a lesson in that. Power built on fear and corruption is always temporary. The empire always falls, and the king always dies. The only question is how they'll be remembered. For Al Capone, the answer is complicated. A legend, a villain, a cautionary tale, a man who wanted to be untouchable and discovered, too late, that no one ever is.